Indeed, there is a lot to talk about, everyone. How's it going? It is another global sort of update from the Global Gambit, the podcast that looks at everything from international relations, geopolitics, economics, and of course, the latest around the Iran war, which is relative to earlier on in the year, obviously, a little bit slow. It's a little bit calmer, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe my guest, Trita Parsi, is going to disagree with me on that, but even perhaps the August tardiness that seems to slow down everyone is even influencing Middle Eastern decision making. But Trita, it's always a pleasure to have you on.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Goodness me, where to start, really? What do you make of this impending deal, MOU, between Oman and Iran? Anything to shout about, or is it just sort of a lot of words on paper?
No, I think it is actually very crucial because at the end of the day, this war that was never about the Strait of Hormuz, because the Strait of Hormuz was not an issue before Trump started the war, has now taken a central role in this whole theater now. But I think we also have to put it in context. I would say that the conflict at this point is really dependent on three separate baskets. One is Strait of Hormuz, one is the nuclear issue, and one is Israel-Lebanon and the broader regional ceasefire. So even if the situation with the Strait finds a temporary solution, and what it appears to look like is increasingly what the Iranians were pushing for earlier on, their interpretation of what the MOU essentially should be, but with greater detail. Even if that one is resolved, and as a result, there is a return to some form of a ceasefire, it does not mean that a final end to the war will occur, because the Hormuz issue needs a final solution. And for the war to end truly, there also needs to be an end to the nuclear issue, as well as to the issue of the regional ceasefire, which then entails what Israel is doing in Lebanon. So it is crucial, it's necessary, but it's far from sufficient. You're on mute.
Sorry, it sometimes does that. Yeah, I'm a natural at this, as I always say. No, I guess, Trita, the thing that comes to mind for me really is just how, perhaps not the deal itself, but how sidelined the United States seems on this. That they're not involved, and it's just sort of you'll take what you get kind of treatment. But also, more interestingly, that Trump doesn't seem to have thrown his toys out of the pram yet. The Trump administration seems relatively mute over this deal.
So, look, formally, the negotiations are between Iran and Oman. And this is by the design of the Iranians. They're essentially saying the future of the Strait will only be determined by the countries who have territorial waters in the Strait, Iran and Oman. And they're deliberately trying to exclude not only the other GCC countries, but also other countries such as the US. And they, for instance, made the example that if it is usage of the Strait that justifies a seat at the table, then China should be there before anyone else, because so much of what is going out of the Strait is going to China. In fact, it's using the Strait more than certain GCC countries are doing because of the degree of its imports from the Strait. So they've managed to reduce it to only the countries that have territorial waters. In reality, however, it is crystal clear the US is part of this negotiation, because the Omanis, frankly, are not negotiating on behalf of Oman. They're negotiating on behalf of the other GCC countries and the US. Oman's own position on this issue was much closer to that of Iran. They're the ones who suggested a joint management system. They're the ones who suggested environmental service fees instead of tolls, etc. And this is something that has annoyed the American side quite a lot. But in this current situation, they are essentially trying to represent the position of the other GCC states and the US as well. So the US is there, but because the Iranians are in far greater control, they have essentially succeeded in making sure that formally the negotiations do not include the US or any of the other GCC states.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting here is the detail of this deal. But again, it's always the sort of how to say planning versus execution. For what I understand, it's not public, but I think the general consensus is that it's a sort of Iran gets effectively control over the inbound route, and Oman controls the outbound leg of this arrangement strategically. But clearly, Tehran has more of a say over it overall. Would you say that's right? And the Gulf
And
states.
also let me just say, the negotiations keep on going back and forth on a critical issue here. So when I wrote my thing on Substack the other day about why the US actually should accept this and go back to actually what is the real US interest in all of this, and I can talk about that a little bit. But by that time, it looked as if it was going to be exactly what you said, that there is Iranian control over the inbound, and then the outbound is going through Omani territorial waters. There would be notification to the Iranians when there's any entrance and approval. And when there's any exit, there would also be notification to the Iranians, but the Iranians are open to also making sure that that notification goes both ways to the Omani side. As of late last night, according at least to what the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson said, the negotiations appear to have shifted back to an earlier Iranian proposal, which was that there would not be two different channels. There would be one channel. But that channel would go through both Iranian and Omani waters. It will kind of go in and out of both of them. And as a result, involve both of them in both the inbound and the outbound. I don't know where exactly things stand on this matter. I do understand that the American side was more open to the idea of two different channels with two different directions, rather than one channel that goes through both of these waters, because that latter proposal does appear to be one that actually would give the Iranians a greater degree of control, while at the same time diluting the perception, the impression, the optics of Iranian control. But it's not clear to me exactly where they are on this at this very point.
No, we've had quite a few different guests sort of speculating on this as well, and just you've got a bit of your mic's a little bit wobbly. I don't know if if you can improve that, but yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, on the China front, look, I think that the Chinese have been a lot more involved than on face value, and frankly, it gets frustrating with the lack of agency the media gives them, if that makes sense. That they've been heavily involved in the scenes. I think you and I have discussed this in the past with Pakistan. And you don't get the Pakistanis just being the mediators at this level without some kind of influence from Beijing. I think that's pretty clear. But I'm curious what you think this means going forward with the balance of power. If the Americans are leveraging hard power and it hasn't worked, can the Chinese adequately leverage soft power in the same way in the influences of any return to the MOU?
I think, first of all, the Chinese are playing this very cleverly. They could have gone in if they wanted to and just really screwed over the United States in a very visible way. And they have completely refrained from that. In fact, even when it comes to their diplomatic involvement, they're staying very low key. They don't want their fingerprints on this. They don't want to have ownership of what comes out because they don't want to own this problem because they're not convinced that it necessarily will be resolved. If they step in a very high profile way, then suddenly this debacle that Trump has started would be something that China would also be responsible for. The Chinese are far too self-centered, and I say that in a positive way, focused on their own interests rather than to try to take advantage of these things in a matter of essentially screwing over the US. But they have, both in the previous MOU or the Islamabad rounds and in other places, played a bit of a diplomatic role in the background without wanting credit, without wanting having any fingerprints on it. Their core interest is to just make sure that there's enough of a stable flow of oil so that they can grow their economy, which is what they care mostly about. Now, when it comes to, sorry, the second aspect of your question was?
Well, just the capacity for the balance of power.
Yeah, what about, yeah. That's where I think that, I think it was already clear from the first war. It has now become crystal clear after the second round that the United States really does not have any military options against Iran, which means that going forward, despite the fact that I'm sure Trump will keep on issuing threats, we're in a completely new scenario in which American threats against Iran simply will not carry the same weight that they have done in the past. Because in the past, those threats had not been exercised. it was a question mark for everyone. Exactly how would such a war end? To what extent would such a war favor the United States or end up in a scenario that would be really disastrous for the US or for the Iranians? Now we have a far clearer idea. The US is not well equipped to do this war. It's a different story, perhaps, if it wants to go in with ground forces, but at the same time, if you have ground forces, you need at least a year of preparation. It needs 500,000 troops, probably minimum, and a far greater degree of American buy-in amongst the public. And the public never bought into this war. This war had never more support than about 25% of the population. You cannot start a major ground war without that level of support. Remember, the Iraq war was started with support levels around 79%. This war started with about 25% support. So it's a completely different proposition. But it does mean that going forward, now we have a better idea of what the military option means. And it doesn't mean anything particularly good for the US. And that is not just because of the shortage of American interceptors. It's also, and this is not something the US can fix in the long or perhaps even medium term. It's also because of the fact that the US itself is now running out, not just of interceptors, but projectiles, period. Tomahawk missiles and other missiles, which means that it could not have continued this war for particularly long, which really raises the question. What were those people, whether they are people on the outside, such as FDD and others, or people on the inside, thinking when they were pushing for the idea that there should be a major escalation, that the US should finish the job by doing a massive, massive escalation, when it turns out that the US actually does not have the capacity, the resources, the bombs to actually pull that off.
Mm. Yeah, we had General McMaster on the program earlier on in the week, and he's more hawkish, shall we say, on the Americans' military capacity, as I'm sure many people would be unsurprised to hear. But, just on the China front, from my understanding, the Iranians have been giving quietly overhead missile launchers. Now, I don't know the exact name. I'm not a military analyst, but that has been quite important in how they might be able to deal with certain American threats in the Strait of Hormuz in the future. But that being said, McMaster's emphasis was that, okay, America hasn't achieved its military objectives right now, but the Chinese can't do anything likewise if they wanted to. They have a base in Djibouti and a couple more in the South Asian theater, but that's about it. What realistically can we expect from any other power to displace the United States? I'm not calling in favor of the US being in the Middle East, but in this way. But realistically, okay, they're out of munitions, but they're still present, right? And a lot of countries welcome their bases in those countries. So how do you look at that?
Sorry, I don't quite understand McMaster's argument here. So he's essentially saying, yes, the US has not achieved its objectives in the war, but neither would China or anyone else were they to be so stupid to start their own war with Iran. Is that his argument?
It's not necessarily about the war with Iran. I think it's more about the military primacy of the United States is still unmatched.
Okay, but the primacy cannot exist unless there is a capacity to control and to dominate. The war has proven that the US lacks that. Yes, there's still countries in the region that for the moment do not have any other options but to rely on the US while they are looking into options of diversification. That's not a sign of primacy. Sign of primacy is that the United States actually is the dominant power, and as a result is the decisive factor, is the decisive party in terms of determining certain things. This war has proven that the United States is not that. Its military presence are all means towards achieving that. Its military presence has failed to achieve that. Now, the better argument, in my view, is that primacy in the Middle East does not serve US interests. And as a result, it is okay that the United States actually does not have that level of control in the region, because the region is not that strategically vital to the United States any longer. McMaster would probably not agree with that at all. He would probably think that every region in the world should be dominated by the United States. But how are you going to convincingly make that case when the US has failed to assert its dominance in the Persian Gulf? How is it going to be convincing that the US could do that in the South China Sea or in other areas that arguably are far more crucial to the United States if the US could not do this against Iran? And Iran is a military power that is of a completely different magnitude than what China is.
Yeah. So to contextualize, I promised my viewers that I would be more forthcoming in challenging guests a little bit more. And certainly a lot of what you said is actually what I challenged McMaster with at the time. But the other thing that he went on to say, and I'd like your response to this or thoughts on this, is simply that the United States has for too long tried the diplomacy route. They've tried the sanctions route. They've tried the appeasement route. None of them have worked. And therefore, the only approach to deal with the Islamic Republic is maximum pressure, is sustained military operations. But my countenance was, but how can you do that if you're going to run out of munitions and if your aerial campaign has not created the effective behavioral change, let alone regime change, that you're after? And he went on to say some things, but I'm interested in what you have to say.
All right. I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh that much, but I mean, the premise of everything, or as you were portraying what he's saying, which I think is completely accurate because I've heard him say these things before, is frankly laughable. We have tried diplomacy for too long. The United States has pursued a policy of containment, sanctions, and confrontation with Iran for 47 years. There was a brief pause for about 3 to 4 years in which the United States for 2 years negotiated the JCPOA under Obama, and then for an additional 2 or so years, that deal was implemented. It was never given a chance to be fully functional because Trump pulled out of it. So if you want to have a track record of saying, okay, give sanctions or war a chance, sanctions have been pursued for more than 4 decades. And look where we are right now. Diplomacy was pursued for about 2 years, and it was allowed to work for 2 years. During those 2 years that it worked, the Iranians did not expand their nuclear program. They were living up to all of the obligations that they had under the JCPOA. The authority on that is not FDD or any of these different outlets that are far closer to the Israeli perspective on everything. It is the IAEA, and they issued 14 reports in a row certifying that the Iranians were living up to their agreement. In fact, the Trump State Department itself issued 2 reports in a row, which infuriated Trump, that also certified that the Iranians were living up to the end of the bargain and that the deal actually served US interests. So we have ample example of the diplomacy working. It led to a deal. The Iranians held to the deal. And all of the disasters that we're dealing with right now are coming as a direct result, consequences of Trump pulling out of that deal and Biden refusing to do the simple thing of just going back into the deal, instead trying to renegotiate the deal and utterly failing at that. The Iranians were also at fault towards the end of that process, but in the beginning, the biggest mistake Biden did was that he just didn't go back into the deal through an executive order, which he could have done and chose not to. So if we had a scenario in which diplomacy was pursued for 10, 15 years and it didn't yield anything, then perhaps we could say that, okay, there's at least some data in support of what McMaster is saying. But that is not the case. We don't have that data. The data that exists is very limited. And for that period, it actually worked perfectly. Did it change Iran's broader foreign policy in the region? It did not, because it was not designed to. Nor did it change America's broader foreign policy in the region, because it wasn't designed to. It's like making a deal on the nuclear issue and then being really upset that, the Iranians did not agree on supporting the US on some other issue that is completely unrelated. That was not part of the deal. What was part of the deal was that if we gave diplomacy a chance and let the deal stay on for a couple of years, we could build on that diplomacy and start addressing other issues, everything from missiles to their support for various groups and the concerns the Iranians have, in which the US is building all of these bases around the region and arming every one of their neighbors to the teeth, which the Iranians perceived as a threat. But we were never given a chance to actually explore that diplomatically, thanks to people like McMaster himself, who was in the government and serving the Trump administration during this period in which they went back to this disastrous sanctions policy of maximum pressure.
Yeah, I mean, look, from my time of working in crisis group for a time, that was under Robert Malley, and he was obviously one of the most instrumental voices during the whole JCPOA. We've had Alan Ear on many times. He was a key negotiator. Colleagues, peers of yours, who I'm sure you engage with on a regular basis. And, I think that clearly there wasn't enough time given to really see how either side would engage. And the other thing that I think a lot of people appreciate about the JCPOA was just how much of an effective multilateral agreement it really was, to have so many co-signatories from not just the West and the E3 with the Germans and whoever, British, French, but also the Russians and Chinese to agree to such a thing with the Americans. It was quite an impressive feat.
It was a different world back then, truly. And remember, the negotiations on the JCPOA occurred in the midst of the Ukraine crisis of 2014.
Yeah.
And despite significant differences between the US, the Europeans, and Russia, they managed to compartmentalize that and not allow that to bleed into the negotiations with Iran. None of that type of discipline and compartmentalization appears even remotely possible today.
No, in the days when you could see in the UN Security Council somewhat agreement around North Korea or Iran or certain things, it's all gone. After 2016, 17 with Trump's election, he is the catalyst for much of it. But,
and if I say, obviously you're not McMaster, but I do think that there needs to be, given how disastrous this war has been, and given the fact that we now know that the Pentagon is coming out with its own numbers that says that we don't even have enough Tomahawks, yet you have people like individuals from FDD, the same group that McMaster is a part of, going around arguing for finish the job, do a massive escalation. With what? With what? I mean, this is the issue. They appear to have the capacity of being wrong consistently for 25 years, but never being held account for the disastrous advice that they're giving. They're the ones who, for instance, were behind this whole idea that this blockade of the blockade would cause the Iranian economy to crumble in 2 weeks. Did that happen? It didn't. Yeah. Yet they're out there just throwing out more and more idiotic ideas of how we escalate matters further, which so far has only made things much, much worse.
I think that's the most impassioned I've heard you, Trita, for a while. No, but look, I mean, from my perspective, and I try to be diversified. I'm not going to say balanced, but diversified in the opinions that I have on the show. And it's interesting that the Israeli perspective, or those from FDD, have been surprisingly tricky to agree to come on. I've spoken to at least 3-4 of them. I've hosted 2, but there's a general sort of, I don't know, hesitation maybe to want to come on to shows which aren't purely leaning towards one narrative. It's not a personal attack on any of them, but it is a little trend that I have noted. But I wanted your thoughts on this, because earlier today, I believe it was, the Washington Post was reporting something quite interesting, that Trump has essentially blindsided Hegseth, or was blindsided by Hegseth, over this THAAD Patriot depletion, right? What does that say about the US command and control right now to you?
I don't know the degree to which we can draw big conclusions. To me, it was actually most surprising that Hegseth, who otherwise have been one of the strongest advocates for escalation within the administration, one of the strongest advocates for the war in the first place, for the second round of that war, that he seemed to be on the side of being okay with this information coming out. I can understand that Trump in this moment does not want this information to be out, because at the end of the day, it does strengthen, and I picked it up on the Iranian side as well, that they are increasingly convinced Trump simply doesn't have a military option. And this is the position they wanted to end up in. They wanted to be in a position in which the US no longer had a military option, because they believe only then will the administration genuinely negotiate and really commit itself to diplomacy. And I can understand that from Trump's perspective, he does not want to go to the table with a military option that has been so hollowed out that it is completely transparent at this point, because so much of what the US's leverage has been is to be able to threaten military force. But this is the situation that is a direct result of having started this war in the first place. And not to in any way, shape, or form diminish the foolishness of the first decision to go to war. But at least I think we can say back then, Trump seemed to have some sort of an idea. It was a dumb idea, but he had an idea that this would take 4 days. He had been convinced by the Israelis that the Iranians were much weaker than they were. The Iranians had also done things that had confirmed their weakness, or their supposed weakness, in Trump's eyes. So he acted on a perception that he thought was reality.
Okay.
But to then restart the war after knowing how it ended up in the first place, after knowing that there's apparently no new plan, there's no new strategy, no new intelligence, and massive depletion of both interceptors and other projectiles, it's just stunning to me. What is the excuse for that? At least in the first one, he could say, I thought it was going to be easy. What can he say this time?
Well, Trita, I mean, it's always enjoyable streaming with you, having a conversation with you on Substack or YouTube, and certainly on when we post this live later, the tagline I will be using is "Trump had an idea." It's a dumb idea, but it was an idea. I mean, I think you give him too much credit, though. I think you give the administration a little bit too much credit, though, Trita, because what was the idea? Decapitation strategy? That's completely lunacy without or warranted.
No, I start off with saying that, I don't want to diminish the foolishness of doing this. I'm just trying to say, at least we can point to that back then they seemed to have a idea. Decapitation, quick capitulation. They had just come out of Venezuela. They were on this sugar high. They had an idea. What was it this time? I mean, there's nothing you can point to. I remember we talked about it earlier on. When the whole thing started, I assumed, because I couldn't just presume complete irrationality, I assumed that there was either a new plan, a new strategy, new intelligence, new military tactics, something that they thought would turn the war around. And we saw nothing. We saw nothing of the bombing campaign or anything like that that seemed to even resemble a strategy. And I find that that's simply stunning.
How much time do you have, by the way?
Let me check my calendar. About 5 minutes.
Okay. Okay, I got a couple more questions for you then. So, if this is the reaction from Trump, trying to, like Putin in some ways, keep down the realities of the military situation, what options does the United States have left? Just simply accept an off-ramp and try and make it look like some kind of favorable deal? Or can they try to leverage other military assets that they haven't utilized, like ground forces, which would obviously be insanity?
No. I think by now it should be clear. The more you go down that path, the more of a deep hole you dig for yourself. I think the US's position is weaker now than it was before starting this second round. And I think when it comes to the Strait, there is an exit there, and it's not a bad exit. I mean, when you take a look at it historically, the US's focus has not been on control over waterways. Its focus has been on making sure that the waterways are open, non-discriminatory passage, and stable passage. Who controls the water systems, etc., is a secondary objective because of the manner that it can impact the first objective. You don't like the idea of a hostile power controlling the water system precisely because it could close it. Reality is, though, that this war did not give Iran this control. This war revealed that they always had that control. So you're not giving them anything by acknowledging that that capacity exists. But if you shift your focus to the first objective and try to get a deal through an Omani-Iranian management system that keeps the water open, keeps the flow going, it is non-discriminatory, it does not allow the Iranians to willy-nilly, reject countries, etc., then you're achieving your primary objective and you're giving up a secondary objective whose only purpose was to support the primary objective. I think the US absolutely can live with that. It's going to take some difficulty for Trump domestically in Washington because he will be accused of all kinds of different things. Some of them based on a confusion of not really recognizing what is the primary American interest, what is the secondary interest. They're just merging the two as if they're one and the same. But then you have all of these other issues, as I mentioned earlier on, which is not resolved automatically just because of the Strait being resolved. But I think that a quick, to the extent that it can, be exit out of the Strait and then focusing on the nuclear and on the regional is the best route that the US has at this point. And what it should be careful to do is to not needlessly give up leverage that potentially could be useful in those negotiations. And the main leverage that the US has in those negotiations are still intact, although the Trump administration has undermined them to a certain extent. And that is the promise of sanctions relief. And the reason I say that it has to a certain extent been undermined is because the strength of that incentive, the promise to the Iranians that would generate them giving concessions, is the stability of sanctions relief. But when you see Trump striking deals and reneging on them on Twitter 24 hours or changing their terms on social media, it undermines the strength of that incentive, of that carrot. And that ultimately is to the detriment of the US itself. But if it can restore that credibility, which I think it can, it will still go into those negotiations with very strong cards as long as it is willing to stick to that negotiation instead of constantly thinking, perhaps I can improve my negotiating position by bombing a little bit. That's not going to work. We know that by now.
Yeah, I would simply say that, I do think the midterms are a key inflection point. It's the Democrats to lose. But also, I mean, what you said there, I think, is what I've been saying for months, which is simply that this war of choice gave the Iranians a strategic clarity. They always knew that the Hormuz Strait was important, but it gave them such a clarity over just how much more important it was to them, that it's effectively their nuclear option more than the actual bomb. But I guess, Trita, I've got one quite blunt question for you. Well, bonus one, actually, if that's right. But the main question, which is simply, we're talking about talks, we're talking about a deal, but this is all such arbitrary language. It's so ambiguous. And frankly, I'm bored to death of it, sick to death of it, as well with Trump's tacoing. But simply, what does that mean? An MOU is not a deal. It's just an agreement that we are going to go to talk about an actual deal in the future. So is this going to be 2030 and we'll still be negotiating details? Like, at what point will we wake up and there's actual substantiated, right, sanctions relief like this, nuclear threshold like this?
Yeah.
Do you have any time horizon?
If we didn't have this problem in the Strait and didn't waste weeks on this diversion towards the second round of war, we would be talking about the nuclear issue right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the deal that is now being negotiated may clarify some of the ambiguities that existed in the MOU on the Strait. And as a result, whether it is the ideal situation for the US or not, nevertheless, if it's stable, then it enables the US to move on to the other issues, and particularly the core issue from its standpoint, that is the nuclear. But as long as it doesn't, as long as it allows the Strait to remain a distraction, or is unwilling to push back against Israel, as it is now once again bombing Lebanon, then, instead of getting to the nuclear issue, we're going to deal with the regional ceasefire in Israel before we get to the nuclear. So if I was in the American shoe, I would move very fast to get to the nuclear issue as quickly as possible and not allow these other issues to become extended distractions, and certainly not allow them to bring the US back into a completely unnecessary war.
Mm. And Lebanon, I feel like we're just being Groundhog Day, Trita. Seriously, like the most epitome of Groundhog Day. If in sort of a month's time, we're literally back to where we were in May, June, where the Iranians were like, well, if you don't stop bombing Lebanon, Israel, then we're just going to, it's just a repeat. It's deja vu, like, wow. But anyway, my bonus question is, what happened to the merging of the wars with Ukraine and Iran?
I wouldn't hold out on that at all, in the sense that I'm very pleased to see that it didn't seem to have much traction in Washington. And I can say that talking to a lot of people here, that there is an unwillingness to deliberately go in that direction. What I wrote in my article was very much not that the US would deliberately choose to do this, but that it would take small decisions that nevertheless would make that scenario more likely. I've not picked up anything on Zelensky's rhetoric that seems to suggest to him that he's still not trying to merge the two wars rhetorically. So I think that this is one of those things that it was not a one-off. This was not a simple idea that would just be tried once. I suspect that we may end up coming back to it. The fastest way of making sure that we don't go in that direction, of course, is to get back to the MOU and make sure that there isn't a second war to merge it with.
All right. Well, a two-front war is still pending, according to Trita Parsi. Trita, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Everyone, thanks so much for your time. As always, have a great rest of your week, and we'll speak soon. Trita's a regular on the program. And if you haven't already subscribed to his Substack or YouTube, I think he has a YouTube channel now, then do be sure to do that. And of course on Substack as well. If you're watching from Substack, then do support his Substack. He writes great pieces, and he wrote that provocative piece on the Ukraine-Iran fronts, which I thought I would just challenge him on a little bit. And if you enjoyed my line of questioning, or you enjoyed the conversation, we did have HR McMaster on, we have Trita on, we have Larry Johnson on, we have Ross Harrison on, we have David Petraeus on, we have Sarah Payne. We have a wide array of speakers on the show, as well as my own analysis. And I'm doing a lot more on Substack now. So if you haven't already subscribed, then do so. I'll be doing more for paid subscribers as well as those free of you. The free ones, you get all these streams. I'm never going to put these behind a paywall or something like that. But I might be doing a weekly Q&A. As well as a deeper solo analysis on a theme that particularly caught my eye that week. So if that's of interest to you, then do subscribe. And thanks to the 2,000 of you who have already on Substack. It's very cool to have a growing community there. And well, look forward to more streams, look forward to more collaborations. And well, we'll see you tomorrow, or maybe later actually, because we've got a stream in with Larry in just a couple of hours. We'll speak soon. Take care.